In today's video, we'll take a look at the best and worst Radiant spells you can get in Lords of the Fallen. Unfortunately, quite a few of them are severely undertuned and in a serious need of a buff. However, there are still a ton of options left that are very strong and provide some unique, powerful effects. As always, a thumbs up on the video would be greatly appreciated, and let's dive right in. Now, if you played with the Paladin class, you're kind of familiar with the Radiant Flare and eventually its upgrade, the Piercing Light. Both of these are options that will absolutely carry you all the way into the end game, especially the Piercing Light, which you find not too late into the game as you make your way to the Fitzroy's Gorge. It's going to be right there on the right side as you make your way to it, but this remained one of the best options in the game. It helps you a ton with ranged damage. Its damage scales up very well, especially if you upgrade your Catalyst to the point that it can still feel good and relevant all the way to the big bosses that you will eventually fight with. Plus, it helps you to lure out any ambushes from afar in case you have trouble with that. Another one that I found even better, and this is actually a boss spell, is the Blast Reflection. You actually get it very early from Pieta by using her Remembrance. So what I like about this is that it lets you use exactly the same two summons as she uses in the fight with you, and depending on their distance from the enemy, they do slightly different things. So if they happen to be in melee range, they will use that melee slam attack that can also stagger enemies. However, if they are too far away, instead they will cast a double beam attack that can deal even more damage. And what you're looking at right here is some of the highest spell damage of all the Radiant spells I tested. 1000 damage with not fully maxed out Catalyst, but it's definitely on the high end right there. The only couple of downsides I can think of is the fact that it takes a bit of while until they appear after you summon them, so you have to stay a bit back from the enemy. And second of all, if you cast them in tight spaces or tunnels, they tend to despawn or just spawn behind walls, case in which you're kind of wasting it. But in open spaces, it's one of the best and coolest spells to use. Another very interesting and potentially powerful spell is the Lucent Beam. This can only be acquired from Don Meyer by being very far into his questline, basically at the stage in which you have to retrieve his Umbral Tome right here as you make your way into the mines section. And then you also have to defeat the boss at the very bottom of those mines and bring a different item to him before he accepts the Umbral Tome. But once you do that, you can just buy the Lucent Beam from him, and I found this to be an excellent Radiant spell. So it's kind of like a beam attack that works in a pretty good range. However, it does damage over time every like half a second or so, but the damage is really good. It's so good in fact that oftentimes I found it almost instantly one-shotting enemies for some reason. I'm not sure exactly if that's just the way the damage stacks up or the way it interacts with enemies as they move, but I oftentimes notice that it just completely melts enemies. It doesn't always happen, but even in its default state, it still deals what I would consider very good damage. It will consume quite a bit of your mana, but compared to some of the other spells, it can definitely help you against bosses or tougher enemies. The only downside is that its range is quite limited, so you're still going to be within the enemy's range and they can touch you if you're not being too careful. Also, since we're on the subject of Don Meyer's items, you can also buy the Radiant Weapon very early on from him. It's pretty much one of the first things you can buy. And like I said in the Paladin guide, yeah, just weapon enchantments in general are very strong in this game, creating that build up even more so than the usual and giving you the effects from it. In the case of the Radiant Weapon, it's the Zaps of Smite damage, which is totally worth it and something that every Paladin should use all the way into the end game, no matter what. But he eventually also sells you a bunch of healing spells, so let's talk about a few great healing options. Early on, you can get the Healing Radiance from him, which is not too shabby, definitely falls off a lot more into the end game, but this can be a nice substitute if you are left with no Sanguinarix charges, but still have some mana left. You can just use that instead, heal up a little bit, and push on forward until you reach the next Vestige point to save your progress. But there are even better options, and one comes right after the Pieta fight. At the top of the tower right next to her, you're going to find this chest, and inside of it, you will find the Sanctify spell. So this, again, I would say it's C to B tier because it's very stationary, so you will have to place down this spell. It's going to create this circle that heals you and also cleanses any status buildup. So I found that the healing over time is not too shabby, but the downside is obviously that you have to remain inside of it to benefit from it, which in many situations it's not feasible because the enemy damage is much greater than the healing itself. However, it can cleanse status buildup as long as you enter and re-exit it, so it can definitely be helpful in case you're fighting a lot of poison enemies, for example. However, in my opinion, the best healing spell is going to be the Invigorating Aura that you can buy from Stonemoon at any point in the game as long as he's not dead. But this is going to give you a heal over time effect that will last as long as you still have mana. So yes, it will consume that mana just slightly over time, but the heal that it gives you is really good. So if you don't want to worry about healing and just non-stop attack and then like not focus too much on healing items and healing animations, this can help you a ton. And again, it seems to stack very well percentage wise with the amount of HP that you progressively get as you move on in the game. There's also a very good top tier defensive skill you can get early on from Skyrest. Just going here onto the lower level next to Eustace, there are some destroyable crates, and on this bench you'll find the Aura of Tenacity. So I really like this one. The Radiance requirement is very low, just 8 points, but this is going to reduce about 50% of the incoming damage once you activate this. It consumes even less mana, if anything at all, compared to before, but yeah, this is going to reduce a ton of that damage that enemies deal on you. For example, in the case of this bigger brute, it was almost dealing like half of my HP into damage attacks. However, with the aura on, it only took down about a quarter of that HP instead. So very good one, and it's going to be even better in the end game as you have more HP and a lot more damage to mitigate. Moving on though, we have a very interesting spell that works very good, but only if you spam it. So that's the Divine Arms, and you get this from the twin statue bosses called the Abiding Defenders that you will find in the Mans of the Hallowed Brothers. So there's going to be an arena with them, and yeah, this is what drops from them. However, you're going to play it wrong if you only cast it once and kind of let it do its own thing, which is mostly going to just miss targets. So how you want to play with this is essentially try to spam them and cast as many of them as possible. The mana requirement is not too big for that, and what this does is that it's going to immediately overwhelm the battlefield with a ton of these traveling swords in the ground that will slash through anything in their path. Now the tracking is not going to be the best, as the AI sometimes misses or just goes in the opposite direction, but if you spam them, they just go all over the place and they will deal a ton of damage. So this can potentially be very good in tight spots where you kind of have a ton of enemies. You can just unleash these and they will scatter around, damaging everything. Again, it's not too bad if you cast it this way, but yeah, otherwise it's going to be pretty mediocre. But the next one is even worse, I'm afraid. So it's called the Radiant Guardian. It's again a Remembrance boss spell. You're gonna have to defeat Tancred at the bottom of the Tower of Penance, and this is what you get from his Remembrance. So what this Radiant Guardian does is it summons this orb that starts shooting at your enemy. Now it does seem as if it deals good damage, like 200 per hit. However, I think that it's a pretty bad spell nonetheless. It doesn't last for too long. It only shoots for like 5 or 6 times. It can only maybe help you with ambushes because it can spot enemies behind corners or maybe behind cover. So yeah, maybe it can help you with that, or maybe to just apply a bit more pressure on the target. But I found that the time you waste casting it is not worth it. It would have been way better if you could cast 2 of these at the same time, then it would have been potentially good. Another remembrance item is the BRIAR Storm you get from the Judge Cleric, so this is going to be very late in the game. This looks extremely cool as it is extremely weak, so definitely in need of a major buff. What this does is essentially exactly what the boss does. It causes these vines on the ground to appear, as well as a bunch of falling arrow storms that will deal damage to every enemy that it hits in a pretty good AoE actually. It's not too bad, but the damage is very low, just 28. So I think that this should have double components. One, it should make those briars / vines to slow enemies and also deal some extra damage over time, and also have the arrow storm also deal damage on its own. So right now definitely needs a big buff, and it's way too punishing because it keeps you stuck in that animation, so not really worth it at the time being. Now the next item is going to be in the Empyrean area, so quite late into the game, pretty much one of the last maps, and you will have to just make your way the normal way in here, go through these courtyards all the way almost at the top. There are going to be some annoying enemies that you have to defeat or completely ignore. However, you will eventually reach this location with a couple of junctions, but you will want to keep it to the left side instead, as this will bring you to this light temple area. And there's going to be an altar here with the color red in the back that will give you a pretty good spell called the Consecrate. So yeah, this is going to be another AoE ground effect that you can place down. However, you can spam a lot of these. You can place down almost as many as you want. They will have a duration of like, I'm not sure, 30 seconds, but they will deal damage over time. Actually about 80 damage to 85 over time, which is really good and potentially can help you a ton when you're overcrowded with enemies, or if you place them preemptively on an enemy path just as it's trying to reach you. It can help a ton even in boss situations, and for some reason, just like in the case of that beam attack, this also has the potential to one-shot targets for some reason. Again, not really sure exactly what the interaction is that causes that, but from the looks of it, it's, yeah, right there at the junction between two circles, which caused one of these bigger brutes to immediately get melted. So yeah, definitely sign me up for that. An amazing spell, even if it is currently a bit broken. Now, moving on, next we have what's called the Radiant Slash. You can buy this from Dunmeyer once you start bringing him some items. So this is something that's also quite early. However, this is the worst spell in the entire game in my opinion, or maybe second to another one that I'm going to show you in just a bit. So this, in theory, should be amazing because you're using your weapon to kind of launch this ranged attack that pierces enemies with light, and in theory it should be good if you can line enemies up and kind of have that slash pass through them. However, what makes this so weak right now is that it doesn't scale with your sword, but actually with your catalyst, obviously, which means your sword attacks will literally be much better at dealing damage and are much faster than this, and also don't consume mana. But worst of all, the biggest offender is that this only works if you use it in very straight lines. If you go at an angle, even a slight one, or even if the enemy stays in some kind of corner, it's going to completely miss them. Even if you're close to them, there are many iffy situations in which, yeah, the damage just doesn't trigger at all. Not sure what the problem is with it, but it seems to have a severe tracking problem right now, so I would completely avoid it until it gets fixed. And this brings us to the final 3 spells that you can buy from Stormund late into his quest line. So essentially, again, as you make your way to that Empyrean area, from the courtyard, you're going to just take the stairs 2 times and then just go in the back here. You're going to find him at the side of this wall in this kind of like smaller courtyard. But essentially, once you reach this point, even if you didn't do anything for him, he will give you a bunch of spells, including the Barbed Aura, and he also gives you these 2 right here, like the Radiant Orb and the ORIUS Judgment. Now, ORIUS Judgment is by far my favorite of the ones that he sells. It's definitely one of the top tier Radiant spells that you can get in Lords of the Fallen, because this is another one that you can just stack on top of each other. So you can cast as many of these as you want. They will continuously cast lightning storms against the target, zap them continuously with radiance damage, and overwhelm them quite simply. I even tested this against bosses, and yes, it's absolutely viable to just spam this and take down a boss in that way. Maybe not like the biggest of the bosses, but it's definitely going to help you with a few thousand damage if you just waste a full on mana bar. But otherwise, it looks amazing as a spell, one of my favorites and definitely worth it. Plus, the casted animation is rather fast. Another one that I didn't like was the Radiant Orb. So this will send an orb that deals damage and also leaves a healing trail. Well, not really trail, because you have to be pretty much inside of it to get the healing. However, it's really bad. The tracking is bad. You have to be inside of it to get the healing. Oftentimes, it doesn't stop unless you literally aim at the ground, which is not always going to be possible, or at the wall. Otherwise, it just passes through the enemy, barely deals any damage, and you're kind of losing on that healing effect. Maybe in crowded spots, it can be useful, but even that situationally, and as long as the enemies don't have much HP, like you can see, it only deals like 48 damage over time. There are much better options that you can use. If it gets buffed, however, I can see this potentially becoming great. And finally, the worst offender and the worst spell right now is by far Barbed Aura. Again, you buy this from Stormund. So this in theory should make you very damage reflective. It gives you an aura that just strikes back at the enemies. However, the damage is just 15. So this is so bad that even low level enemies from the swamp barely get phased by it. And yeah, you could theoretically just combine this with the aura of protection and kind of like survive a bit longer, but I'm not sure why exactly you would stay in the middle of a crowd and reflect very mediocre damage. You're never going to want to do that. Hopefully, if this gets buffed at some point, it will become viable, but right now, it's something I would completely avoid using. Anyway, that is about it with all of the Radiant spells. Let me know down below if you have any favorites among them, and I'll see you guys in the next video.